The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards as the wind brushed against the windows. Ethan sat in his study, his laptop glowing faintly in the dark. It had started innocently enough. One of his friends had jokingly mentioned a dating app over lunch earlier that day. "You'd be shocked at how many people you might recognize," his friend had said with a smirk. Ethan wasn't particularly curious at first, but now, with Clara already asleep and the house wrapped in stillness, he found himself downloading the app. It was a strange and surreal space. Ethan scrolled through profiles, chuckling at exaggerated bios and poorly written introductions. But then, his breath caught. There she was, Clara. He blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, it was unmistakably her. The photo wasn't lewd or overt, but it was nothing like the Clara he thought he knew. She sat on the edge of a bed in a softly lit room, wearing a loose blouse that slipped off one shoulder, revealing bare skin kissed by golden light. Her lips held a faint smile, one Ethan hadn't seen in years, a playful, teasing expression that felt foreign and intimate at the same time. The profile name read Amelia, but there was no mistaking her eyes. They held the same depth that had captivated Ethan the first time he'd met her. His fingers hovered over the mousepad, trembling as he clicked to open the profile. The bio was brief. "Looking for someone who makes life feel electric. Let's keep this between us." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He reread the words, hoping they would somehow change, that they would prove him wrong. But the more he stared, the heavier the weight in his chest grew. For a moment, he closed his laptop, pushing it away as though it had burned him. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His mind was racing, but his body felt frozen, as if every limb had turned to stone. Could it be a joke? A cruel coincidence? Or worse, was this real? Ethan's thoughts spiraled. He thought of Clara's recent behavior, the nights when she stayed out late with vague explanations about work, the way she had started turning her phone screen away when a message came through. He dismissed it as paranoia, convincing himself that he was overthinking. Now, he wasn't so sure. The weight of doubt pressed hard against his chest. Memories flashed in his mind, their wedding day, the vows they had whispered to each other, the quiet morning spent together with coffee and soft laughter. What had gone wrong? When had things changed? But Ethan knew one thing for certain, he couldn't ignore this. With a deep breath, he reopened the laptop. His hands moved with an almost mechanical precision as he created a profile of his own. It wasn't to lure her out or confront her directly, not yet. He just needed to understand. His profile was simple, deliberately vague. He added a picture of a scenic view rather than his face and left the bio empty. His heart pounded as he navigated the app, his every movement tinged with dread. When he searched for Clara's profile, Amelia, again, he stared at her picture for a long time. It was surreal to see her like this, framed in a context that felt so alien to their life together. He clicked like, unsure if she'd even notice, and logged off. Ethan sat there in the dark for hours, staring at nothing in particular. Questions filled his mind. Was she unhappy? Was this my fault? But there were no answers, only the faint hum of the laptop and the relentless thudding of his heart. As dawn began to creep into the room, Ethan made a quiet decision. He would wait, watch, and gather the truth, not through anger or confrontation, but with patience. Clara was his wife, the woman he had promised to love through better or worse. But first, he needed to understand just how deep this wound went. The storm had begun, and Ethan could feel its weight pressing on the horizon. The days that followed were a slow, suffocating descent into uncertainty for Ethan. He had always thought of himself as steady, someone who could handle pressure with grace. But now, with the weight of suspicion gnawing at him, he felt unmoored, a sailor drifting in unfamiliar waters. Clara's behavior seemed, at first glance, unchanged. She still kissed him goodbye in the mornings, her lips brushing his cheek with a warmth that felt hollow now. She hummed while making coffee, her movements smooth and routine. Yet, Ethan saw things differently now. He noticed how her laughter at dinner sometimes felt distant, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. When her phone buzzed late at night, she glanced at it and quickly set it face down. These small details, once insignificant, now screamed for his attention. Ethan couldn't bring himself to confront her outright. Not yet. Instead, he became a quiet observer, gathering fragments of information like pieces of a puzzle. He started leaving work early, hoping to catch glimpses of her routine when she thought he was away. One afternoon, he parked down the street from Clara's office, hidden behind a line of cars. He watched as employees filtered out of the building, some in groups, others alone. Eventually, Clara emerged, her figure graceful as ever in a navy blue coat. She wasn't alone. A man walked beside her, tall and broad-shouldered, his laughter carrying faintly across the parking lot. Clara smiled at him, a smile Ethan hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the polite curve of her lips she gave strangers, or even the warm grin she shared with friends. It was brighter, freer, as if she'd shed a part of herself Ethan no longer had access to. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening. He followed at a distance, his heart pounding with each turn they made. The man and Clara didn't go far, just to a cafe nearby. Ethan parked across the street, watching through the large windows as they sat at a corner table. Clara leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her expression attentive. The man reached out, his hand brushing hers briefly. The touch was subtle, fleeting, but it sent a sharp ache through Ethan's chest. He didn't confront them. He couldn't. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing. Who was this man? A co-worker. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Ethan felt like a stranger in his own life, walking through the motions of a marriage that had once felt unshakable. He watched Clara more closely now, searching her every word and action for meaning. She was warm, attentive even, but there was something guarded about her. A layer of distance Ethan hadn't noticed before now felt as obvious as a locked door he didn't have the key to. The tension came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening. Ethan had told Clara he'd be late, inventing a fictional meeting at work. She had smiled and kissed him goodbye as usual, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a brief second before she left for the day. It was that fleeting touch, so familiar yet now so full of doubt, that nearly broke him. Instead of going to work, Ethan parked his car a block from their house. Rain streamed down the windshield as he waited, his breath fogging the windows. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, he would find it. Just after 7 p.m., Clara's car pulled into the driveway. Ethan straightened in his seat, his pulse quickening. He watched as she stepped out, her figure graceful even in the pouring rain. But she wasn't alone. A man climbed out of the passenger seat, a man Ethan instantly recognized as Marcus from the picture on Clara's phone. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots as he watched Marcus walk around the car to join Clara at the front steps. They exchanged a few words, their voices muffled by the rain. Then Marcus reached out, his hand brushing her arm, lingering for a moment too long. Clara didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a smile Ethan hadn't seen in years. The two of them disappeared into the house, leaving Ethan alone in his car with nothing but the sound of rain and the thundering of his own heartbeat. He sat there for a long time, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to storm inside, to demand answers and lay bare all the secrets that had been eating away at him. But another part of him, the part that still loved Clara more than anything, held him back. Instead, he stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through his jacket almost instantly. He approached the house quietly, his footsteps muffled by the downpour. The back door was unlocked. Clara often forgot to lock it, and Ethan slipped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. From the living room, he heard voices. Clara's laughter, light and musical, mingled with Marcus's deeper tones. Ethan moved closer, staying in the shadows. He could see them now, sitting on the couch. Clara was leaning toward Marcus, her body language open and relaxed in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. Marcus reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The intimacy of the gesture was a knife to Ethan's heart. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. He stood there, frozen, as if the weight of what he was seeing had pinned him to the spot. His mind screamed at him to act, to say something, but his body refused to obey. Finally, he stepped into the light, his presence cutting through their laughter like a blade. Clara saw him first. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock and guilt. Marcus turned as well, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Ethan," Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, her hands trembling as she stood. Ethan held up a hand, his jaw tight. Don't say anything." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Ethan and Clara. "I think I should go," he muttered, already moving toward the door. That's a good idea, Ethan said, his voice low and steady, though every word felt like it was being forced through a clenched throat. Once Marcus was gone, the silence in the room was deafening. Clara stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of Ethan's gaze. "How long?" Ethan asked finally, his voice cracking despite his efforts to remain composed. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. I don't know," she stammered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then what was it supposed to be?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. He took a step closer, his emotions finally breaking free. "What were you looking for, Clara? What was I not enough of?" Clara sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "It wasn't about you," she choked out. "I don't even know what I was doing. I felt lost. I felt invisible." Invisible? Ethan's voice was softer now, though his anger still simmered beneath the surface. "I've been right here, Clara. Always." Her hands fell to her sides, and she looked at him with eyes full of pain and regret. "I know," she whispered. "And I hate myself for it." The sight of her standing there, so broken and vulnerable, stirred something in Ethan. As much as he wanted to hold on to his anger, he couldn't deny the love he still felt for her, the bond that years of marriage had built between them. "I don't know if I can forgive this," he said, his voice trembling. Clara stepped closer, her hands reaching out hesitantly. "I'll do anything to make this right," she said, her voice barely audible. "Anything, Ethan. Please." Ethan closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words sink in. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked upstairs, leaving Clara alone in the living room, her quiet sobs echoing in the silence. The storm wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if they would weather it together. The night dragged on as Ethan lay in their bed, staring at the ceiling. Clara wasn't beside him. She hadn't come upstairs after he left her in the living room. He imagined her still sitting there, wrapped in the heavy silence of their unraveling. His thoughts were a mess of memories and emotions. He remembered the early days of their love, how they used to stay up talking until the first light of dawn, the way she used to look at him as though he were the only person in the world. Those moments felt so far away now, replaced by the aching knowledge of her betrayal. Yet, mixed with the anger and hurt, there was something else, an echo of the love that had bound them together for so long. It was faint, buried beneath layers of pain, but it was there, pulsing quietly in the corner of his heart. He couldn't sleep. The weight of the evening hung too heavy in the air. Finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer, he got out of bed and made his way downstairs. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Clara was curled up on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She looked small, fragile in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, wide and uncertain, as though she wasn't sure if he was there to comfort her or deliver the final blow. "I didn't expect you to come back down," she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the armchair opposite her and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I need to understand," Ethan said finally, his voice low and steady. "I need you to tell me everything." Clara wiped at her eyes, her movements slow and deliberate, as though gathering her thoughts. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she began, her voice trembling. "When I made that profile, I didn't think anyone would even notice. I wasn't looking for this. I just felt so lost, Ethan. Like I didn't recognize myself anymore." Ethan's brows furrowed. "Lost how?" Clara let out a shaky breath. "I don't know. After years of the same routine, the same everything, I started to feel invisible. Like I wasn't Clara anymore. I was just your wife, or someone's coworker, or someone people barely noticed. I missed feeling alive." Her words stung, but Ethan forced himself to listen. "And Marcus?" he asked, his voice tight. Clara winced at the name. "It wasn't about him," she said quickly. "I know that's hard to believe, but it wasn't. He was just there. Someone who said the right things at the right time. Someone who made me feel seen." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But it was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Her words were raw, honest, but they didn't make the pain go away. "Why didn't you talk to me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling?" Clara looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Because I didn't know how," she said. "And because I was scared. Scared that you'd see me the way I saw myself, broken, unworthy." The weight of her confession settled heavily in the room. Ethan felt the anger he'd been holding on to start to crack, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He wanted to lash out, to make her feel the hurt she had caused, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he sat there, trying to process the depth of what had gone wrong between them. "Do you love him?" The question escaped Ethan's lips before he could stop it. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "No," she said quickly, her voice firm. "No, Ethan. It was never about love. It was about me being stupid and selfish and looking for something that I should have been looking for in you." Ethan studied her face, searching for any hint of deceit. All he saw was raw honesty and regret. "I don't know how to fix this," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I want to try. If you'll let me." Ethan leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. The weight of the decision before him felt crushing. Forgiveness wasn't a switch he could flip. It would take time, effort, and trust. Trust that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. But as he looked at Clara, sitting across from him with tears in her eyes and her heart laid bare, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Not yet. But I'm willing to try. For us." Clara's breath hitched, and she nodded, her tears spilling over once again. "That's all I want," she whispered. Ethan stood, crossing the space between them. He sat beside her on the couch, hesitating for a moment before reaching out to take her hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Clara clutched his hand tightly, as though afraid he might pull away. They sat there in silence, the storm between them finally beginning to calm. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, they were facing it together. And that, Ethan thought, was a start.